Hey, what's up? It's Dave. I'm gonna show you real quick how to pass some data. So this is usually common when you have like a list view of things and you want to be able to click on that to go to another screen that has more details about whatever it is in the list. So I've got a list here of properties, and what I want to do is when the user clicks on a property, I want to navigate to a details screen here. But I want this page to be dynamic. I want it to display different types of data or different data, in place of all this, depending on whatever property was clicked on. So how do I get the data that I need to pull in all the details for the property after I click on one from here? So the first thing that we can do is we're going to go to details. This is where we want to end up. So this is the screen that we're going to. And if I go over here to the data tab, the very first section here at the top, navigation parameters. So this screen doesn't have any navigation parameters yet, but we can create some. So what data do we want to send? You might think that we would want to send like all the data. And usually, though, when you're pulling in data into a list, you're only going to be pulling in the data that you need. So in this case, like in a real life app, you would, if I'm only showing an image and the name of the property, that's really only the only data that I would be sending to my front end. So, and I would also be sending the ID. So that's the main ingredient here. Is we're going to pass this ID. Every record here has an ID and it's unique to it, right? And we can use that ID to then look up that property on the details screen. All right, so I've got this details screen again, and I've got this create navigation parameter. So I'm just going to add one here for ID because that's what I want to pass. And there's some different options here, but if you're just passing some data, that could be a string, a number. It could even be a JSON object or an array. Then you would choose data. Workflow is going to be if you want to pass in an action workflow. So like when you have a button that you click on and you have a trigger like on press, you can pass in an actual workflow as well. Then icon obviously lets you pass in an icon, and asset lets you pass in an asset, which would be like an uploaded image that you have in your assets. So now that we've got, so we're going to create this ID here, and I'm going to click OK, and that's going to create this new ID here, and I can set a default value. And so what this default value does is, because when we're actually viewing this screen, we haven't passed any ID to the screen yet, right? So if this screen is relying on an ID in order to fetch some data, and we haven't passed it any data because we haven't navigated and passed the ID to it, we have to give it a value to use in the meantime. So in this case, I'm just going to give it a 1, and that will represent the first, the ID of like the first item in my data. So let me show you. So I've got this fetch on my list, right? And that's pulling in all the data, but I have another endpoint that just gets a specific record. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a fetch here. Actually, yeah, and then I'm just going to put this in there and put this in there as well. Oops. All right, now to my fetch, I'm going to grab my endpoint. So I've got get properties, and that's what I was using on the list. And now I have get property, which is the singular. And you can see when I select it, it's expecting an ID. So now you can see how we connect the dots, right? We're making a fetch request that uses the ID of a record. And so here we've got 1. That's the default value that I have set up in the API endpoint. But if we drop down here you can see there's a section called navigation parameter, and it's got an ID. That's the ID that we created on the screen. So I'm going to select that, and now it's going to become 1 again, but it's going to be using the value here, right? Because we selected this navigation parameter. So on the fetch now, the fetch is actually using that number 1 for now, because remember, that's kind of our placeholder value until we actually pass it an ID when we navigate. So we don't see anything yet because we're not using this data, but the data is coming in with our fetch now, so we can just wire up all these things. So for this data for my image, I can expand this, and I should have all the data from my property from that fetch here. So I can just find my image URL, plug that in. This up here is going to be like the city. So I can come here, I can type in city, find the city. Then I can come here. This is going to be the title or the name. Type in name, find name. And then I'll do this one is the price. So let's do, I actually want to keep everything except for just the price. So I'll say price in there like that. Come here, look again for the price. We'll do nightly price. Last one is going to be the description. Search for description. Oops. Plug that in. Okay. So here we go. Now we've got our screen, and it's being populated by the data coming from this fetch, which is set to the navigation parameter. And then the navigation parameter right now has a default value of 1, which lets us actually preview our screen. Okay, so now we can connect the dots between this screen and the next screen, right? We've got this screen, and it's ready and waiting for an ID to be sent to it so that it can populate all of the components that need that data. And then from our list, now we've got a pressable here on each of these. So I can come to the interactions tab, and then on press, I want to navigate to that other screen. So I'll click navigate, make sure I got that action selected. I'm going to leave it for the default behavior. For destination, I'm going to select that details screen. And when I do, this new section pops up to pass data. And if you click here, you can see it gives you a little explanation, a link to the docs. And so we need the ID of the record that was clicked in that list, and we can actually access that right here. So you can see the very first thing is list item. So that's going to be the actual list item that was clicked on, and we can see the ID right here at the top. We just click the ID. That's what we want to pass to it, and close this up. And now if we click on one of these, we can see that it passed that data. And you see now, every time I come here and click on a different one, it's loading up that dynamically, right? So we don't need a detail screen for every single record. We basically create a template, right? And we use that ID to fetch some data using that value, and we give it a default value so that it has something to pull in while we're working on the data. But when it's actually in use, it's dynamic.